Okay, so here's the thing from your lab guide. Again, just remember there is no quiz over this lab, but this stuff could show up on the next lab practical. And then some of this information, like this bone surface marking stuff, is actually good to know for like the next lecture exam also, okay? So there's the microscope slides that you need to know, with the exception of elastic cartilage. You can cross that off. I just couldn't find it. I don't know where the hell it ran off to. I will show you what it looks like, but I'm not going to test you on it unless I somehow find and give you a chance to actually look at a real slide of it. But so you got these different types of cartilage. You got the compact bone. One thing I want to tell you, you may have noticed about all four of those slides up there, they all have lacunae, all right, which are these little tiny fluid-filled spaces. And inside of those lacunae are going to be some type of cell. If it's a piece of cartilage, then it's going to be a chondrocyte that's inside of the lacunae. If it's a bone slide, then it's going to be osteocytes that are inside of the lacunae. And one of the things that's really tricky is that these cells usually fill up the entire lacunae. And so when I point at something, and if I were to point at one of those things and say, what is this? It can be hard to know what I'm talking about. Like, am I pointing at the cell that's there, or am I talking about the space that the cell's inside of? So to get around that, I usually pose the question in such a way to make it clear. Like if I say, what is the cell here? Then say, osteocyte or chondrocyte. If I say, what is this space called? Then you'd say lacunae. All right, I'll show you what I mean when I get there, but I just wanted to point that out before I go on. Long bone structures, I'll show you a picture that was similar to, it's actually, I think, the exact picture from your PowerPoint. Types of bones, I'll show you those under the camera up there. And then the bone surface markings, I'll also show you some examples of those under the camera up there. So let me go with the slides first. So, anyone know what this is? This is hyaline cartilage, all right? Hyaline cartilage, the word hyaline means like glass-like or something like that. And it got its name because the space, the extracellular matrix, is very clear. It's like one solid color. It might, it depends on what stain you use. It might be like light purple or it might be light pink. But you don't really see like individual fibers. You just kind of see this solid color that almost looks like stained glass, okay? So that's kind of how it got its name. All these little things that are inside of it, all these things everywhere, those are all lacunae. And inside of the lacunae are chondrocytes. And then the dark things that you're seeing represent the nuclei of those chondrocytes. So, if I were to point at this and say, what is this, which I wouldn't do, you might not know what I'm talking about, like, and what am I asking for? But so if I pointed at this, I might say, what is the cell here? In which case you should say what? Chondrocyte. Or I might say, what is the name of the space here? In which case you should say lacunae, right? So that's what I mean about, kind of differentiating between the two. Here's some more hyaline cartilage. Again, just kind of that sort of glass-like appearance to the extracellular matrix. That's kind of the giveaway for that. Then we got this. Anyone know what this is supposed to be? This is supposed to be fibrocartilage, okay? The key thing with fibrocartilage, and I had a hell of a time finding this on the actual in-class slides, but I know there's at least one good one roaming around, is that oftentimes the cells will line up in rows, right? So you see how these cells are kind of lined up, single file, like in rows, all right? That's a key feature of fibrocartilage, if you see that, okay? All these kind of big pink stripes that are in between, those are supposed to be collagen fibers. Once again, the same rule applies though. All of these little things that you see everywhere, those all represent the little lacunae, and inside of them, filling up the entire lacunae, is a chondrocyte. Okay. One more of fibrocartilage. Again, notice how the cells are lined up in like rows. Okay, you can see that there. This is what elastic cartilage was supposed to look like if you could find it. All I can tell you is the extracellular matrix has this kind of like dirty or hairy appearance to it. You see all these little fibers kind of running around in between. It's not nearly as clear as like hyaline cartilage was, okay? It's got a very dirty looking extracellular matrix, and that's because it has all these little tiny elastic fibers that are really stretchy, okay? Here's a closer picture of You can see what I mean, kind of that dirty appearance. Again, don't worry about this stuff. I just wanted to tell you about it because, I don't know, I feel like I'd be leaving something out if I didn't, so I told you about it. What's this?
Bone.
Yeah, this is bone. Now you're expected to know a little bit more about the bone, though, than you did before. And should have drawn this before, but I just remembered it. The way I kind of look at bone, just to sort of simplify it, you got this kind of circular thing in the middle, and then you've got rings around it, like this. And then if you look really closely, there's actually little lines that kind of jut outward from the middle, almost like rays of sun. They come out like this, or spokes on a wheel. It's hard to see those, but they're there. And then also sitting within these circular things, you got like these kind of little black dots that are scattered like everywhere like this. Okay? So, what are you looking at? Well, the whole thing, or like this whole thing here, that would be a what? That's a, starts with an O, rhymes with bastion. Osteon. So that's an osteon, that whole round thing, or this whole round thing, or that whole round thing. Or the other name for an osteon is a Haversian system. You're welcome to use that name too, I don't really care. In the middle of each osteon, so in other words, right here, or in this case it happens to stain kind of black, that would be the central canal. That would be where you'd have a lot of little blood vessels running. The rings that go around in a circle, okay? In other words, these rings that are going around in a circle, those are called lamellae. And then the things that come outward that are a little hard to see, that almost look like spokes coming out of a wheel, those are the canaliculi that are coming out like that. And then these black dots that you see everywhere, once again, just like you saw with the cartilage, those are actually lacunae that are filled up with, in this case, osteocytes, because it's bone, right? Just make sure you're careful about that. Remember, if you see bone, it's going to be osteocytes. If you see cartilage, it's going to be chondrocytes. Okay. Here's a close-up of one osteon. Again, the whole thing would be the osteon. This is the central canal. The layers that are circular are lamellae. The little fine lines that are coming outward are canaliculi. And then the black dots represent lacunae with osteocytes inside of them. All right, I think that was all I wanted to say there. Oh, okay, so now the long bone structure. So this is literally a picture from the PowerPoints. So the shaft part, anyone remember the other name for the shaft part?
Diaphysis.
Yeah, that's the diaphysis. Good. And then the very end parts are referred to as the epiphyses. Okay, so diaphysis, the very ends are the epiphyses, and then kind of the space in between the epiphyses and the diaphysis is called the metaphyses. Okay. At the very ends of the long bone, you're going to have these little caps of cartilage. That's called articular cartilage, and that's because that's what's going to form a joint with another bone. Okay, so at the very ends, you got articular cartilage. Surrounding the outside of the bone is a thin layer that they're actually pulling off here. That's the periosteum. Okay. Inside of the diaphysis, it should be hollow, and that's going to be the marrow cavity, or it's also called the medullary cavity. And what type of bone marrow do you find in the marrow cavity?
Red, yellow.
Yellow. All right, yellow bone marrow is inside of the marrow cavity. Okay. There is a lining to the marrow cavity. You can see them pulling it back there. That's called the endosteum. Then, at the ends of the bone, inside the epiphyses and metaphyses, what type of bone is this here? That's spongy bone. And what type of marrow is that? That's the red bone marrow that's kind of in between the spaces of the spongy bone. Okay. One other thing to notice up here, what's this thing that's going across here? Yeah, that's the epiphyseal line, and that represents, where your growth plates were. Just remember for lecture exam purposes, when you're a child or a teenager, what kind of tissue is that made out of when you're a child or a teenager? Cartilage, and that's what allows you to keep growing and getting taller, but then eventually it gets replaced with what kind of tissue? Bone, and that's when you stop growing, right? And remember, the name changes also. When it's made out of cartilage, you call it the epiphyseal plate. When it becomes bone, you call it the epiphyseal line. Okay? All right, types of bones. I'm actually going to do this with the dot cam up here, so let me do this. Okay, so it says types of bones you should be able to identify and know examples of. So, you know, I could, like on the next practical, I could be like, give me an example of a long bone, or give me an example of a flat bone, or give me an example of a regular bone. And you could use the examples that are listed here if you want to, or you could use any other ones that fit. So if, you know, if I said give me an example of a long bone and you said femur, that would be right, okay? But make sure you do know these specific examples, because I might work backwards, right? I might say, you know, the humerus is what type of bone, and you'd have to say long bone. Or the trapezoid is what type of bone, and you'd have to say a short bone, okay? So just be, you know, ready and make sure you know that stuff. Again, just so you can see these examples of these bones, so you actually recognize them. Here's an example of the humerus, okay? The humerus looks like. And then an example of the sternum, I think you know that already. There's the sternum. An example of the vertebrae, the regular bone, which would be like this guy here. That's the vertebrae. And the next one, the short bone, the trapezoid. The trapezoid is actually this little one that's right there, okay? There's actually 8 wrist bones. Most of them are classified as short bones, but that's probably the best example of a short bone, the trapezoid. And then the sesamoid bone would be the patella, and you sort of have to pull the tendon back so you can see the patella. Okay. Next you have the markings. So make sure you know this table really well. You know, on the lab practical, I might give you the word, and then you have to tell me what the definition is, or I might go the opposite direction and give you the definition, and you have to tell me which word fits, okay? So know this backwards and forwards. Let me just show you some examples of each of these. So a condyle is a rounded bump, usually fits into a fossa to form a joint. So if you look at the ends of the elbow, these surfaces down here, these are rounded, and they represent condyles. Okay, so those are examples. Now there are specific names of them. You don't have to worry about that yet. Eventually you will have to learn that, but those would be examples of a condyle. Epicondyle is a bump near a condyle for muscle attachment. So again, at the elbow joint, there's kind of a bump here. You can see it more on the side here, but there's also a bump up there. That is classified as epicondyles. They sit above the condyles, and they represent attachment points for muscles or attachment points for ligaments. A facet is a flat surface where bones form joints with other bones. So, I don't know, the best example I could give you of a facet is if you look at some of the vertebrae, you look up close, on these two things that are projecting upward, there's kind of a flat surface here and then over here. Those are facets that are going to form a joint with the vertebrae that's above it, basically. Or if you look from this end, you can see here's a facet here, and there's a facet over there, and that would be forming a joint with the vertebrae that's below it, right? And that's how they kind of stack upon each other. So facets are usually flat, that's the key there. Foramen is just the stupid fancy name for a hole. So here's an example of a foramen, right? That's the vertebral foramen, or the most famous foramen is probably this guy. That's the foramen magnum that you can see there. Head. So two good places where you can see a head are on the humerus and on the femur. I've been showing you the humerus a lot, so let me show you the femur instead. Here's the femur, and this is the head. This rounded part is the head of the femur. That's going to fit into the socket that's on your hip bone and form your hip joint. Okay. Right below the head, this narrowed part, that's called the neck. Okay. Meatus. A meatus is a lot like a foramen, except it's deeper and longer. It's more of a passageway that's deeper and longer. And probably the best known one would be the opening that goes into the bones of your head for your ear, right? That's called the external auditory meatus. So that's a good example. And then lastly, trochanter, a large bump for muscle attachment. The only place you find a trochanter is on the end of the femur. This is an anterior view of the femur. If I flip it over though, you can see it better. So this is what's called the lesser trochanter, and that's called the greater trochanter. And some of your important muscles that are in your hip that cause you to flex and extend your hip joint, they're going to attach to these trochanters. All right, I think that's all I wanted to say. I know we're getting out a little bit early. Any questions about any of this stuff? Everyone in pretty good shape about that? Okay. If you think of anything, shoot me an email. Nice weekend.